The great thing about making pizza at home is that almost anyone can do it according to their skill level, whether it's slapping some pasta sauce and a slice of cheese on an English muffin and baking it in a toaster oven, or making the whole thing from scratch and baking it in a 900-degree pizza oven. What I am doing is something in between those. This is a method that I found for making pan pizza that is pretty easy and doesn't require a lot of skill other than patience. One caveat I have to mention is with this method the pan isn't preheated in any way, so the finished pizza has a softer crust than you would typically want. You could call it high hydration bread with pizza toppings if you want to rain on my parade. If you're not picky about that sort of thing, this might be something you want to try. I'll need enough dough for a 10-inch pan. What has been working for me is 80% hydration dough made with 200 grams of flour. For that, I start with 160 milliliters of water, or about 2/3 of a cup. The water is 80% of the weight of the flour, that's what 80% hydration means. Then 4 grams of table salt, or about 3/4 of a teaspoon. Here's a teaspoon of active dry yeast, that's about 3 grams. I'll give it about 10 minutes to hydrate before I add the flour. The yeast definitely mixes better if you let it sit in the water for a while, so I'll do that now. I can't see the salt, so I'll stir it an extra half minute so I can be pretty certain it is dissolved. The internet says that 200 grams of bread flour is about 1.5 cups, and the internet is never wrong, so I'll just dump that all in there. I normally have this bowl on the kitchen scale and measure the ingredients by weight as I add them, but I doubt everyone has a scale, so I'm using volume measurements to make this more practical for people who don't have fancy kitchen gadgets. That's also why I'm using a spatula rather than my dough scraper. I imagine most of you have one of these, and I'm trying to present this in a way that makes it easy for everyone. Wait a minute, it's not supposed to look like this. Okay, so I can tell from past experience that this has more than 200 grams of flour in it. This dough is too stiff and there is no way that it is 80% hydration like I wanted. So I'm going to put this away in the fridge and it can be another baking project. Let's try this again. Here's 2/3 of a cup of water, 3/4 teaspoon of salt, and a teaspoon of yeast. Again, I'll let that sit a while to hydrate the yeast before adding the flour. This time I'll watch more carefully as I add the flour and stop when it looks like the pizza dough I usually make. It ends up being about a cup. I was trying to make these instructions more user-friendly by converting the weight measurements to volume measurements, but weighing powdered ingredients by volume can be problematic because it makes a difference how compacted the ingredient is and whatnot. You can use volume measurements in bread making, but it really helps to know what the dough is supposed to look like and use your senses to know when you have the right amount of flour. If you intend to get into bread making, I would recommend investing in a kitchen scale as they are fairly inexpensive and allow for more consistent measurement and repeatable results. Measuring by weight is useful because the amount of ingredients in dough recipes is based on the percentage of each one relative to the amount of flour. That's how I figured out how much water, salt, and yeast to add to this. Look up videos about baker's percentages or baker's math if you are interested in learning more. What I am doing right now is just making sure all the flour is evenly hydrated. This needs to sit about 20 minutes for the gluten to start developing. For demonstration purposes, this is what happens when I try to stretch the dough out now. It just breaks. Let's cover this up and see what happens when I try that again after a while. As you can see, after 20 minutes of just sitting there, it stretches out a lot better. So now that the gluten has developed enough for it to do that, I can develop it more by stretching and folding. I'm folding it in a complete circle without overstretching and breaking it. I have water on my hands to prevent it from sticking to me. This is going to sit here and relax for 20 more minutes. I'm going to fold this 2 more times. This is the second. The reason I'm waiting between folds is because the gluten needs to relax after I stretch and fold it. Notice how it is kind of domed after being so tight right after I fold it. 20 minutes later, you can see that the middle has sunken back down because the dough loosened itself back up. It takes time for that to happen, so you can't just do all those folds at once without tearing the dough. This is the last fold. Now I'm going to put a little olive oil in another bowl and put the dough in there, coating it in the oil. Then it is going to stay in the fridge until the next day. Okay, it's about 28 hours later and it's time to make a pizza. Now would be a good time to start heating the oven up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, get it as hot as you can get. The pan is going to need a little oil. To get this out of the bowl, I just tilt it over the pan and get a wet hand underneath it to help scoop it out. This is why I like using high hydration dough for pan pizza. Look how it melts right into place. Almost. Gravity is doing most of the work for me. It doesn't spread itself out all the way, but it should be relaxed enough for me to push it out to the edge. I'm just pushing outward like so with wet hands, again to prevent sticking. If it keeps springing back, let it sit until the gluten can relax and try again. It helps to leave a little bit of a gap so you can get it out of the pan. You might see me struggle with this later. When you are new to making pizzas, one thing that is hard to get used to is not putting too much on them, including sauce. For a 10-inch pizza like this, I do about 3 tablespoons of sauce. I'll try to see if I can get it covered with 2 today. I'm using jarred pizza sauce, nothing fancy. You can put whatever you want on your pizza, just not too much. I'll start with a light sprinkling of low moisture mozzarella. This way I can have the toppings between the cheese layers rather than having them sitting on top and burning or completely buried. This is my favorite combination of toppings that I have tried. Fresh oregano goes on first because I actually want it to get covered up. I'm trying to put on enough that there will be 1 or 2 pieces in each bite. Here's some bacon. It seems a little overdone, so I'll put it on next to make sure it gets well coated in additional cheese. Then 1/4 of a small red onion. Actually, that looks like enough, so I won't put the rest on. Now I'll put the rest of the mozzarella cheese on. That's about 3 ounces shredded from the block. Block cheese melts and cooks better than pre-shredded cheese, but pre-shredded cheese is more convenient. Prioritize accordingly. Finally, some feta cheese. Okay, let's put that in the oven for 12 minutes. Looks like the cheese got a little overcooked with all that grease sitting on top. Also, the crust looks pretty pale. Putting a little sugar in the dough helps with browning. Maybe I'll try that next time. If you use enough oil and didn't get it right up against the edge like I did, it should come out pretty easily. I had to pry around the edge with a fork before it finally released. I'm just using the grates on my oven as a cooling rack briefly. It doesn't look like the best thing in the world, but it's good enough that I've been making it every few weeks. It's like pizza you would get at a restaurant that doesn't specialize in pizza, but it's good enough to keep on the menu because enough people like it. The bottom looks a little sad. Professionally made pizzas require really hot preheated surfaces to bake them on to give them their characteristic well-baked crust. If I was going to attempt transferring this to a pizza stone via pizza peel, I would use a lower hydration dough to avoid dropping it in a heaping pile. With this method, the crust gets cooked a little underdone, but it is also more light and airy than it would be if I had to use less water. So I think that is a good compromise.